In this video, I'm going to be learning, practicing and testing out the best ways to prep a canvas so that you don't have to struggle through it like I did. Hi, I'm Jess. I'm an 18-year-old aspiring artist, and I recently realized that in order to be good to sell my art, I have to practice, and I don't know everything. So I just figured that I would document the process of me learning all these different steps of oil painting and business in a new series called Learning Art from Scratch. Very original, I know. But yeah, if you would like to follow along, I'm just going to go through all the different steps that you might take in painting. And in this video, it is going to be the canvas prep. And next video is going to be underpainting and so on, so forth. So the first learning from this video was when I realized that the amount of surfaces that you can use and the different mediums that you can use are all together. There are just so many different options for you to use for like surface prep. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's a very individual process. You can watch this video, but at the end of the day, if you don't do oil painting, it's probably not going to be the same process as me. So then after figuring this out, the next step would be to figure out what surface I wanted to do. And I had a couple in mind. I had wood, I had canvas, I had paper, and I kind of knew straight away that paper probably wasn't going to be what I wanted to do this test on, just because it's not the surface that I want to sell my art with. Definitely practice, but just not sell. And then the wood and the canvas I was tossing up with, but I actually ended up going with canvas because it's just the surface that I've been using. I have heard that wood is really good for oil painting, but I really wanted to use rabbit skin glue and see how that tightened up the canvas. However, obviously you can't do that on wood, so we just went with canvas for this video. And then I had to split that into 3 options, which was canvas roll, canvas pre-stretched, and a panel. And I ended up going with the pre-stretched one just because it's the most accessible for me at this current moment. Although I have dabbled in the panels in the past, and I would love to learn how to stretch my own canvas, but for right now this is just where we're at. And so yeah, that is the intro, and now we can go into how I'm going to do this test. So when I'm doing this test, I'm trying to think of five different measures, I think. Yeah, which is the time, the cost, the ease, the smoothness, and the quality of the barrier that the prep creates. And I'm going to be rating each method out of 5 at the end, and then put it all on a little tally board, and then it'll also give you guys insight. And so hopefully at the end that table will help you guys out, and it'll just be a little bit of an easier way to measure how this all goes. So first of all, let's talk about how the underpainting went on this canvas. To start off, the method I used was a mix of the oil paint and some Gesso, and then I just apply that and I try and map out where I want some of the main items to be on the canvas. And I'm not gonna lie, when I did start this painting process, it started soaking in a lot of the mixture, which meant that I started running out of that mixture really quickly, and I had to keep swiping my brush and mixing more. Also, the feeling I got from the brush made me think that over time this process could definitely contribute to a more frayed brush, which isn't terrible on the short term, but it was just more something I noticed. Other than that, I didn't really mind this canvas prep method for underpainting, but the main problem started to occur when I started adding the thicker oil paint. One of the most obvious things I noticed during this process, and why so many artists choose to apply extra gesso, is not just about sealing the canvas, but it's the feeling of painting on it. And gesso helps smooth out that gritty raw canvas texture and creates a surface that lets the brush glide more easily. And so without it, painting became a little bit harder. As I started laying the paint down, it soaked into the surface straight away, which made the whole experience a lot less enjoyable. You can see in the footage throughout that even when my brush was fully loaded with paint, it barely made it across the canvas. The paint just didn't spread well, and I kept having to go back, reload and remix, which honestly got frustrating really quickly. However, I laid one layer of the paint and it seemed to spread better, but it's still not great that it happened in the first place. Now, you may be thinking that it's it's not that bad, as in like if that's the biggest complaint then it should be okay. However, this feeling means that you're not getting that oil painting texture and glide and smoothness that is quite literally its biggest pro, at least in my eyes. Another thing that I started noticing, especially in earlier layers, was that the colors just didn't look as vibrant as they normally do. It's like the canvas was sucking like the life out of the paint. Even the colors I know that are usually rich and buttery looked flat and kind of chalky. That's probably because the surface was absorbing a lot of the oil, which is what gives the paint its signature glow and smoothness. And again, it's one of the biggest selling in the first place, so when that's taken away, it's kind of a letdown. So finally, thoughts and ratings. It was obviously the fastest and cheapest method. I literally did nothing but unwrap it, and so if you're doing studies, sketches, experimenting, or just wanting to get to painting right now, this might be for you. Also, it's perfect if you're new or you're just not ready to invest in extra tools or products. But if you're prepping a canvas for a serious piece that you want to keep or sell for long-term use, you probably should do a bit more. And the overall scores for each category are time to prep, which is a 5 out of 5. I mean, I feel like this one's pretty obvious. It took me literally no time. It cannot get faster than how quick it was. Cost, 5 out of 5. It was $0 extra spent on any priming surface or material. This is great for people who want to cut down spending but still want to try painting. Ease of prep was also 5 out of 5. Again, no effort, no tools. And then smoothness was 2 out of 5. I feel like this is pretty obvious. The texture was just not it. It felt way too gritty, way too synthetic. It took away a lot of the paint. It made the paint soak in. The paint wasn't spreading lovely. It was just all around a big no. And then the barrier was a 2.5 out of 5. And I'm saying this because obviously if it's pre-primed then it's okay and it's going to not completely sink in. But quite frankly, there was still a lot of sinking in with the oils. The paint didn't pop or sit amazingly, and the colors were dulled down a little bit more than what they would usually be on the canvases that I would prep. And I've come up with an overall score of 3.9 out of 5, but leaning heavily into very beginner sort of methods and priorities such as time, cost, and ease. But I would not recommend this method, honestly. This was my least favorite. I was kind of expecting it to be my least favorite, but I would not recommend. Okay, so this is probably the method most people are familiar with. This process involves laying down a coat of gesso and letting it dry and then going in with another layer. But here's the interesting part. Even though acrylic gesso isn't oil-based, it still works for oil painting because it forms a flexible water-resistant surface when it dries. The acrylic polymer in the gesso creates a strong plastic-like film that doesn't absorb oil in the same way a raw canvas would. So when you paint over it with oils, the oil doesn't steep into the canvas and rot the fibers, which is the main thing that we're trying to avoid. Although still it's technically not true oil gesso in the traditional sense, but acrylic gesso is way more accessible and still gives you a sealed, slightly absorbent surface that oil paint can sit on top of without damaging the support underneath. Okay, so starting with how the underpainting felt, this was definitely a much better experience compared to the previous canvas. The surface didn't feel as rough and the texture of the canvas wasn't as noticeable. This meant that the paint went a lot further. Depending on your method of underpainting, this acrylic priming approach also makes it easier to wipe away areas with a cloth and bring forward highlights, which is super useful if you're working in a more tonal or subtractive style. Now, it didn't completely eliminate the grit of the canvas, so it still felt like it could have been smoother for this kind of work, but overall I actually really liked this method for underpainting. It gave me a nice balance between the absorbency and control, and it felt like the brush was actually gliding across the surface rather than just dragging like before. Moving on to the main main section, when I started to lay the first layer of thicker paint, I noticed a big difference to the previous method straight away. The paint spread so much nicer on this surface and it felt a lot more smoother. The colors also appeared more bold and vibrant, which I think comes down to the fact that the paint wasn't sinking into the canvas like before, because the acrylic gesso had sealed the surface properly. The oil actually stayed on top rather than getting absorbed, which meant that I didn't lose the richness and the pigment. It also meant I could move the paint around a lot more before it started setting, which gave me more time to blend and adjust tones without the surface pulling too much from the brush. That made layering way easier and more enjoyable. I wasn't constantly reloading my brush to get coverage, and honestly I felt like I had more control over the paint itself, which made this stage of the process a lot more satisfying. This one definitely felt like a solid middle ground, still affordable and easy to do at home, but way better results than just using the raw store-bought canvas as is. The process took me about 4 days to dry, with 2 days for each layer, and if you're looking for a bit more control and paint performance without getting too technical, this method is honestly great. It's ideal for anyone who wants to practice or even work on more refined pieces without investing heat. But if you're aiming for museum level longevity or preparing for a really important piece, just know that acrylic gesso isn't the most archival option out there, although still for the majority of painters this totally does the job. Alright, now into the scoring. So time to prep, I did 3 out of 5. It wasn't horrible, it was definitely doable. I did 2 coats. Took me 4 days to make sure that it was all dry. If I was to do it again, I'd probably do more coats though, maybe 3. But if you batch prepared a bunch of canvases, I'm sure it would be fine. Then for cost, I did 3.5 out of 5. The gesso I used was $9.98, which isn't bad at all, but the higher end brands can get pricey, going up to like $50. The ease of prep, I did 3 out of 5. It was really not that hard. I just got a bigger brush and just plopped it on, made it even, and yeah, that was it. The only problem was the little hairs and specks of dust that somehow always showed up. It got very annoying very quickly. Smoothness, I did a 4 out of 5. It's a lot better than the bare canvas and the paint glided more easily, but there was still a bit of extra grit that could have been a bit smoother. And then the barrier was a 4 out of 5. It was really solid. However, the best thing for oil paint is always going to be oil paint ground, and so it is still a very good option, but just not the best. So it got a 4 out of 5. Okay, so this method was built up as one of the more traditional methods of preparing a canvas for oil painting, and it surprisingly had a few pros and cons that I wasn't expecting. To use the rabbit skin glue, you should read the instructions to the granule to water ratio you need to combine. For the one that I'm using, it was 1 part rabbit skin glue to 13 parts water. For my specific amount that I'm using to transform the granules into a liquid, after making the mixture, I then applied the glue to the canvas using a big brush in thin and controlled amounts. Once I completed that, I let the canvas dry for 4 days to be safe, because I had heard a lot of different things surrounding dry time. Rabbit skin glue is a traditional medium used to seal and tighten a canvas. It became popular in practice during the Renaissance, and even today many oil painters agree that the rabbit skin glue's ability to tighten the canvas is incomparable. While the term rabbit skin glue is commonly used, it actually refers to animal-based glues made from various tissues like bones and hides. Despite the name, rabbit skin glue isn't always also made from rabbits. It's often derived from pigs, cows, goats, sheep, or other small animals, and when you melt the little granules down into a warm water mixture, it turns into a gel/liquid. So after it finished drying, I went in with oil ground, which is a primer specifically designed for oil painting. It's typically made with linseed oil, pigment, and sometimes marble dust, creating a surface that allows for better adhesion and color retention compared to acrylic gesso. It's important that in this part you make it as thin and as even as possible, because otherwise the drying time can vary. I actually let mine dry for 7 days, which is a lot, but I just did not want to risk painting on it when it wasn't fully dry. This method felt very old school, and because it was my first time, I thought I'd mess it up a little bit on the first coat. It went really streaky and kind of clumpy, but after smoothing it out and waiting a lot, the end result was actually really good. So starting with the underpainting, it was insane in the best way. The surface was so smooth and responsive, and the paint just glided on. Honestly, it was one of the best surfaces I've painted on, and I fear I cannot go back. Even just from the underpainting stage, every brush stroke felt really controlled, and I wasn't fighting with any of the weird texture or resistance that canvas might bring up. I could also easily build up the tonal values and wipe away areas to reveal highlights without the surface grabbing too much of the pigment. Then moving on to the thicker oil layers, this is where it got even better. The paint sat amazingly on top of the surface. It did not sink in at all, and all the colors stayed bold and vibrant. I didn't need to keep reloading my brush. There was no patchiness. Blending was smooth. I could push around paint and soften edges and still keep sharp details when I needed them. It also gave me a lot more freedom with texture because the surface held the paint so well. I could build up those thicker, juicier strokes without them collapsing or sliding around. Everything just stayed where I put it, and honestly, it just made the painting experience so much better. Again, the color payoff was just so good as well. It really felt like the pigments that I had put down on my palette were actually transferring properly and how I wanted them to onto the canvas, especially the lighter ones or the more saturated areas. Even the more subtle transitions held up really well without going muddy. I didn't realize how much of a difference a properly prepped surface could actually make until this moment, and it's like everything I was trying to do finally came together, and I really like the end result of this painting, but I also do not think I can ever go back. And overall, this was by far the best painting surface of the 3. I really did not think that I'd be saying that I really couldn't go back, but it was just too good to not keep doing. So the overall ratings, time to prep was a 1 out of 5. It was not great. I'm not gonna lie. It was not really quick at all. It took me over a week. If time to prep is your most important part, probably wouldn't recommend this, honestly. But it's just so good. The end result is just so good, but the time to prep really just is not great. And then the cost per canvas is also not great. This is because obviously you need to get the equipment that you need to make the surface, both the rabbit skin glue and the oil ground, which is like brushes, the bucket, and then you also actually need to get obviously the rabbit skin glue and the oil ground. And I did opt for pretty high quality ones because I kind of knew that I'd be using them after. It's not the cheapest thing ever. Ease of prep, 3 out of 5. There's definitely a high learning curve when you first do it, but it's pretty easy to get right if you just follow the instructions. So I don't know, I put it as a 3 out of 5. I feel like now going into it in the future, it'll actually be probably like a 1 out of 5, at least for me. And then we go into smoothness, which was a 5 out of 5. It was just so amazing. It was just literally the best canvas I've ever painted on. I highly recommend I highly recommend trying it out. If you don't like it, then that's fine, but yeah, it was just so good. And then the barrier was also a 5 out of 5. I mean, the oil paint primer and the rabbit skin glue is meant for oil paint. It was always going to be the best one. It really came out with no sinking, super vibrant colors, and probably the most professional finish of the bunch. And I would recommend this to everyone. However, if you're into serious oil painting and you want museum level prep, this is definitely for you. It's probably not the most beginner friendly or quick option, so if those are kind of important factors to you, then I probably wouldn't recommend this method. Maybe save it for a later time, but it was just so good. And these are my final personal ratings. Hi there. If you like this video, then let me know in the comments. I really liked making it. I found it really fun to try out all the different methods and be able to see them pretty much side by side was really interesting. And I'm really excited to keep making videos. My goal this second half of the year is to stay more consistent with posting, and I'm going to try and focus on YouTube. So if you want to stick around and join me on this little art thing that I'm doing, this little art series, if you will, then hit the subscribe button, and yeah.